Welcome to day 2 of the virtual component of Getting Real 2022 and our exciting keynote speaker that I'll introduce in a second. I'm going to introduce in the following way. Well, you guys know it's Erika Dilday. What's cool about this is, yes, not only do I have the pleasure of introducing Erika, and you guys could read her bio, and she went to Harvard and Columbia School of Journalism. She's the ED of American Documentary, but this is the coolest part about introducing her in person. We kept on having these near misses, and it started in the late 1980s when we were in college at the same time, but never met. And then when we connected years later, like 6 months ago, we started talking about people we knew and really interesting people that came from our same backgrounds. And that took us back into how we became storytellers, and in Erika's case, a journalist. And so when we talked about bringing in a keynote speaker and we came up with your name, Erika, I thought, what an appropriate way, because we've been in proximity really for decades. You know, we're 2 years apart in college class. And how you arrived here, which you'll talk about today, and how I arrived here, I think there's similar trajectories. So I think it's apropos that we're both together here today, crossing these paths that, you know, in some ways started similarly, moved apart, but are back together. So I'm going to introduce Erika Dilday, the executive director of American Documentary, executive producer of America ReFramed, also former ED of Futuro Media. And after Erika speaks, she's going to be available for questions from the audience, both here and virtually. So welcome, Erika Dilday.
Thank you, Rick. And he's right. It's actually very funny how many ways we did cross, even though we didn't know each other, and how many people we knew. And I do think that communities of color find each other. People who are all of a sudden dropped into situations that feel unfamiliar look for people who are familiar. And I think, you know, we made those connections, and I'm glad we're still connecting now. So anyone who wants to make change does not have the luxury of being comfortable. Documentary filmmakers know this better than anyone. Filmmakers go to difficult places, ask difficult questions, and even put their lives on the line to deliver to audiences truths that inform us, that strengthen us, and that hopefully lead us toward real change. But what else can we do to create change? And what should that change be? These are questions I find myself constantly contemplating. I believe that any question that's worth asking is worth asking again and again, and the answer should be probed regularly and somewhat ruthlessly. The short answer to me for both of these questions is that we can make use of our public airwaves to challenge and engage audiences everywhere. The longer answer means examining our individual and collective duty to make sure all stories are told honestly and authentically, and that we include with this the purpose of building something better, not simply breaking what is in place. My journey to get here has shaped how I see some of these issues, so please indulge me as I share a little bit of what makes me me. I was raised by a man who showed me what it took to make change happen. In 1972, my father, Bill Dilday, became the first Black general manager of a TV station in the country at WLBT in Jackson, Mississippi. This didn't happen in Mississippi because it was a uniquely progressive state. It happened because the FCC had a mandate to take over the station for racist practices and mandated that a Black group run it. So we moved down from Boston to Jackson. And certainly my father's new position was an enormous accomplishment and broke all kinds of barriers, but our family's time in Jackson was far from easy. The FBI followed us around for the first few years that we were there, and we were never sure whether it was to protect us or just to keep an eye on us. At my predominantly white school in Mississippi, I was involved in a number of different activities, from playing basketball to eventually becoming student body president. I received a good education and made many lifelong friends. Throughout my time there, I also regularly encounteed overt and covert racism. But my experiences made me stronger. I realized that many people would doubt me and my abilities, and that if I looked to the outside world for validation, I would not find it. I know what it is like to have racial slurs yelled at you and your friends from a car by a group of grinning teenagers. I know what it is like to have an elementary school friend sadly and politely tell you that she must uninvite you to her birthday party because it is at her grandmother's house and she doesn't allow Black people inside. I also learned about bravery from the many change makers and civil rights leaders who surrounded me in my youth. Believing in yourself and what you do and what you have to say can be very difficult at times, especially when society conditions you to believe that your voice should not be heard. But if you don't make your voice heard, how will things change? In 1980, there was a 6-hour big network TV miniseries called Beulah Land that portrayed slavery as a benign institution, with its Black characters docile and even content with being enslaved. My father simply refused to share the series at his station. It was, to put it mildly, an incredibly unpopular decision in the power base of Mississippi. This made an enormous impression on me. I was very proud that my father wouldn't let anyone push him around, that he had the dignity to stand up when the vocal public opinion was against him. I also remember having some people ask me angrily why my father would do something like that. It was then that I really started to understand what was at stake. Being a person of color in a position of power, in a sense, an educator and a gatekeeper, is, in my view, absolutely essential to the broader project of diversity, inclusion, and solidarity. I left Mississippi to go to college with Rick, and those 4 years opened my eyes in ways that were both positive and negative. For one, I'd never lived among such a diverse group of people before. It was an experience that helped me understand how little some of our lines cross. One of my biggest revelations was that there are many people who don't think of Donny Hathaway's This Christmas as the quintessential holiday song. In fact, many of them hadn't even heard it. I also did learn and love the multicultural tapestry of my fellow students. While white people were the majority, I also met people from many different countries, many different hues, and learned to appreciate different histories and traditions, not through books, but through people I called friends. I also learned how many prejudices and biases we carry with us simply through ignorance. I later attended journalism school where I studied long-form broadcast. What really inspired and propelled me toward documentary, though, was seeing the film Hoop Dreams. It changed my mind about what nonfiction film can be. Director Steve James gave Chicago protagonists Arthur Agee and William Gates the opportunity to share the multi-dimensional nature of their difficulties and to show how precarious the idea of the American dream is for Black Americans. One scene that stayed with me was when William struggled to pass the SAT in order to qualify for his college scholarship. This young man might not have been studious, but he did what he was supposed to do at school, and he could not even get the modest score that he needed for his scholarship. Our system failed him because he was poor and Black. The moment makes you more angry than sad, eliciting more empathy than sympathy because you're with the protagonist and not looking down on them. I'm still in awe of director Steve James and what he accomplished with that film at that time. He did it by looking at Agee and Gates and their families as not as subjects, but as people who had agency and dignity. This year on POV, we are showing the film Let the Little Light Shine. It is a powerful story, also set in Chicago, about saving a predominantly Black elementary school. It's made by Kevin Shaw, a young gifted Black producer and director who is also a Firelight Media alum. Steve James is executive producer. This, to me, is how, as a film community, we support filmmakers and evolve in the telling of our stories. My passion for not just nonfiction storytelling, but exhibition grew with the Maysles Documentary Center, where I was inspired to become involved by Albert Maysles and his wife Jillian Walker's desire to move their life and their work to a marginalized community in New York, to Harlem in particular, my community. I didn't come to Maysles expecting to lead the organization, but I really admired the way that they use their influence to bring resources to a neighborhood in need of a cinema and a documentary program. They came into the community with this endeavor, knowing it was best to let it be run by someone from the community. As documentarians who had achieved an incredible level of success, they also realized the playing field wasn't equal. We were lucky enough to have strong organizations of color, such as Firelight Media, doing exemplary work and mentoring countless people. But the Maysles family realized that creating spaces for inclusion and equity wasn't just the burden of Stanley Nelson and Marcia Smith, but the responsibility of everyone in the field. At Maysles, I oversaw community cinema, filmmaking programs, and produced Albert Maysles' final film, the award-winning doc in transit. In my time there, I really wanted the Maysles Center to be a place for everyone. Harlem and its population would always be our primary community, but appreciation for the arts doesn't have to be redlined. While we programmed for Harlem, I felt that our offerings were equally as attractive as anything on Museum Mile. My career has been focused on making authentic and diverse narratives part of the current media landscape, to create an honest and accurate reflection of our country and the world we want to make. I was drawn to my current role at American Documentary precisely because of our mission to amplify unheard voices and new narratives for public media, a space intended for all. And I believe that it is our collective responsibility to make sure that it is truly a space for all by providing diverse, interesting, and accessible content to a public that needs and demands it. Today, gatekeepers as a group are a lot more diverse than they used to be, though we still have a long way to go. We are now bringing different perspectives to what we see and who represents it. Especially in public media, we're seeing the audience change, with young people and people of color being the fastest growing audiences we serve. But I don't want to just count numbers. I want to dig deeper. I want to try harder. This is an excerpt from the Kerner Commission report, a coalition established by Lyndon B. Johnson to investigate the so-called urban riots of 1968. Here's what they said about the uprisings in Newark and Detroit. The causes of recent racial disorders are embedded in a tangle of issues and circumstances, social, economic, political, and psychological, which arise out of the historic pattern of Black-white relations in America. Virtually every major episode of violence was foreshadowed by an accumulation of unresolved grievances and by widespread dissatisfaction among Black people with the unwillingness or inability of local government to respond. This is our basic conclusion. Our nation is moving toward two societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal. I must in candor say to you, members of this commission, it is a kind of Alice in Wonderland, with the same moving picture reshown over and over again, the same analysis, the same recommendations, and the same inaction. These words come to our minds as we conclude this report. Doesn't this sound like it could have been written today? So the question is, why do we keep failing? Across the nonfiction field, there have been many honest attempts to create opportunities for BIPOC and underserved communities to tell their stories and take their rightful place in the world of public broadcasting and in the broader cultural landscape. So why are we here? Why are we still trying to get airtime? Why are we still fighting for funding and authentic representation? I think the answer is pretty simple. In this country, those in power are not willing to truly make themselves uncomfortable to achieve the goals they claim to support. In times of unrest and anger, there's a mix of fear and virtue that leads the haves to insist we do something about access. We tend to focus more on immediate action, but need to think more about accountability. Accountability is more than just an apology or wanting to say the right thing to avoid an angry backlash. Accountability means staying and looking at what you've done and how you've done it, and if you need to do it better. It's asking the questions again and again. I'm not against anger. We should all be angry for so many reasons, but I want to know what we can do with that anger to make change. My anger comes from a belief that we can do better, but that history keeps repeating itself and we don't. From our little corner of anger, we, as filmmakers, can make sure that nonfiction film isn't just passively viewed. We need to make sure it is also a tool for engagement. Good documentaries teach us to listen and really hear the stories of others without getting defensive and attempting to discredit. Rather, they are a catalyst for protagonists to tell their own stories and in the process, help us consider our responsibilities to others. I want us to be better informed and engage with each other and the world around us, despite our distance and differences. When documentaries are made available to all, viewers can bridge these divides and meaningfully connect with the perspectives they present. This is essential to inspire audiences into action. But that also takes trust. Trust that an audience puts in us to deliver information and ideas that they might not normally get to bring them. It doesn't stop with exhibition. We must provide tools for engagement that make these films useful and relevant and inform people in this country with voices that they might not otherwise hear. In order to build trust with our audiences, we have to be willing to get uncomfortable along the way. It's not just about making good films, it's ensuring that access is possible for everyone, because all audiences deserve to see and contend with these films. One example of an environment built in trust is the Maysles Center's Congo and Harlem Festival. While it presents marquee films you'd see at the most prestigious festivals, it also prioritizes films by Congolese students that only Maysles could bring to US audiences. Most of these films wouldn't have ordinarily been seen outside of their country of origin, but the festival ensured that these stories reached a new, broader audience. For trust to thrive among audiences, one must have faith in the audience's ability to absorb, reflect, create dialogue, and take action in ways that our country and this world need. And frankly, this is also about audiences experiencing some discomfort along the journey. That discomfort might take place on both sides of the camera. When I was working on the film Civil War with director Rachel Boynton, we explored how history is taught in our classrooms from President Obama's final year in office through 2020. A crucial goal for the film was to bring people from different sides of the debate together to talk. We learned that it was very difficult to get people to trust each other or to be willing to watch and discuss this film with people who think differently. Our willingness to go there resulted in a subtle but determined approach, forcing our team to be vulnerable even in front of the camera themselves. The film went on to a wide release, streaming on Peacock, and sparking uncomfortable but essential dialogue wherever we screened. Civil War also gave us an early glimpse of the polarization of our country's classrooms we see on display today, from national debates on critical race theory to local book bans. Nowhere have I seen the potential for documentaries to make more material change than I have in the world of public media. Earlier this year, POV premiered on The Divide, a story about the last abortion clinic on the US-Mexico border. We worked with partners across the country, including local stations across Texas, to make sure the film was available to viewers in red states, blue states, and everything purple in between. 2 months later, we learned that Roe was overturned. We quickly worked with the filmmakers to extend the free streaming window, making it accessible to community groups like Trust Women in Wichita. They used the film to educate the community about a state ballot measure on abortion rights in Kansas, and their grassroots efforts helped spark a voter turnout to protect reproductive care in the state constitution. This is what public media can be, an authentic and accessible way to bring documentaries, ideas, and understanding to viewers like us, from filmmakers like us. Public media is part of a broader constellation of documentary spaces we all know and love, but it has a unique position as a populist institution where one doesn't need an exclusive badge to gain entry. It doesn't use an algorithm to filter content for an audience. Instead, its purpose is keeping its citizens well-informed, engaged, and inspired through a sense of solidarity and shared humanity. By making accessible artful storytelling, we reflect the world's diverse reality. I know I say accessible a lot. Here's what accessible means to me. It means that you can view a film without barriers, have them interpreted for you in a manner that works for your language and ability, so that you, the viewer, can fully experience these stories. Access is power. That includes access to produce and present these stories, to amplify and nurture the authentic voices of filmmakers. Public media validates the importance of these artists speaking their own truths and frames the conversation in a way that gives film participants, filmmakers, and audiences the respect they deserve. We owe this debt to ourselves and our audiences, even the segments outside of the fastest growing, to bring them content that stretches them, that enriches them, and that, again, sometimes will make them a little uncomfortable. My question is, how are you going to make yourself uncomfortable? Until audiences are treated in the way they deserve, inspiring action-focused dialogue and real material action, we're not doing our part to help to support a diverse nation in a diverse world. Until we expect more from ourselves and our audiences and believe in their ability to absorb and understand, we are falling short. Until we decide that inclusion is not built on exclusion, we are not going to achieve any sort of harmony or justice. When someone feels left out or marginalized, nobody wins, creating a vicious cycle of displacement and alienation. When people feel they have nothing to build for, they build against. And one of the things that we have to remember is that true reconciliation requires some level of discomfort. Now I'd like you to think about a film that moved you in some way, whether it made you angry, you thought it was ridiculous, or it inspired you. Now think about watching it again. One of the things I found is that when I watch something more than once, I always see something different. Just as I listen to people to understand them, try listening a little longer, not just to form an opinion, but to truly understand. Sometimes you find your opinion will change. Albert Maysles used to say, "How can you love your neighbor if you don't know your neighbor?" I don't know if I'm filled with as much love as Albert is, but my feeling is, how can you understand your neighbor if you don't know your neighbor? To me, seeing what people share about themselves, their lives, and their communities through documentary film is one of the best ways to do that. And it is the duty of public media to facilitate that landscape. We can't look at inclusion as a one-dimensional goal. We have to understand diversity as everybody's problem and everybody's issue. It's not about getting out of the way, but standing in the right place and participating fully and appropriately in our public experiment. Public media is a service for our national consciousness. The opportunity for every person in this country to have the right and privilege to share their stories, their ideas, their take. We need to put the public back in public media to feel a sense of ownership, not as consumers, but as people. What it brings you and what you bring to it. As I moved along in my career, I found meeting both personally and professionally making some kind of difference. I was the first Black woman appointed to an executive director position at American Documentary, also executive producing our POV and America ReFramed series. I'm proud to continue my dad's tradition in acting as a different type of gatekeeper. If you take anything away from this, I hope that you realize that we have to continue to ask the questions and continue to demand more of ourselves as a nonfiction community, and demand more of people on the opposite side of the aisle to engage in productive discussion and interaction. I fully hope and expect that I will hear from people who say, I agree with you, and people who say, I completely disagree with you. I'm looking forward to further discussions, to difficult questions, to being uncomfortable. Thank you for listening.
Well, I see Andrea, our ASL interpreter, interpreting, so I'm going to assume that you can hear us. Thank you very much to our captioner and to our interpreters for providing access, as always. Let's give Erika another round of applause. Thank you so much. So for those of you joining us virtually, please put your questions into chat. I do not have the Q&A function open, and I'm using a Microsoft Surface tablet, which I'm very unfamiliar with, so not going to touch any buttons on this one. And for those in the audience, we will also, here at the IDA office, which is where we are broadcasting from, we will also be taking questions from you in the audience as well. I just wanted to say too that I also went to the same college that Erika and Rick went to, but many years later, if you couldn't tell from this face. But I'm not going to get in on that kind of joy or hype train. But Erika, maybe I'll start off with one question because I don't see any questions in the virtual Q&A right now. But I'm really curious, given your background, given your father's background, which you spoke so eloquently about, given this message of needing to get uncomfortable and of needing to know where we are standing in line, and of some specific experiences that I've heard you talk about before. I'd like for you to sort of, now that we have this more informal Q&A setting, just kind of describe who it is that should be getting uncomfortable a little bit more. Because, for instance, there is something that's also occurring in our field talking about harm mitigation.
Right.
Yeah, and about who it is who should be doing the educating for white power brokers, for instance, for those who might be causing harm. So I'm wondering if you could expand your thoughts about that, since that's such a key part of this talk.
Oh, sure, absolutely. I have a lot of thoughts about this. I mean, I do not believe that anybody needs to be the person who educates the white power broker, who has to stand there and have repeated microaggressions or trauma. I also believe that some people are willing to step in and do that, but it has to be a voluntary thing. And I think one of the hardest parts about it, and you and I have talked about this, is the desire to protest often that comes along with these discussions. There is often an inability when you've been in power for so long to say, maybe I don't know everything and maybe I need to listen. And I don't like this fight or flight mentality either. It shouldn't be about, well, I'm either going to argue with you or I'm just going to leave. I think whether you're, the biggest white power broker or just some little person, you have a responsibility to the community around you, to the people that you're with. And what really makes me angry is the idea that dealing with racism, dealing with white supremacy, dealing with inequity is the problem of those who are experiencing racism or experiencing inequity or experiencing inequality. It's not just their problem. As someone I know said once, if Black people in this country could solve racism, of course we would have solved it by now. It's not going to happen that way. And I think that there has got to be a belief that it's everyone's problem. I know when Rachel and I started working on Civil War, a lot of people wanted to know why she, as a white woman, wanted to be involved in this discussion about race and critical race theory and how it was taught. And she said, because it's my responsibility to. And we had many discussions. One of the things I realized was we'd look at a scene and see completely different things. But it was having that discussion, talking about what we saw, that I think really brought about a better understanding, not just for her, but also for me. There are things that I don't understand, didn't understand why she was going there. But when we were able to talk and probe, I could see. I mean, I didn't realize how big the bubble is in some ways, not with Rachel, but just in general, when you're in power and everything's going your way, you can live in a bubble. You don't have to see anything outside of it. And sometimes I just was really unaware of, how thick and impermeable that bubble is.
Yes, breaking past bubbles, but it's something that we always try to do, these phrases, reaching across the aisle, projecting outside the echo chamber. In many ways, when we are talking about social issue documentaries or even about artful documentaries in general, that's the goal, but it can be so hard to do that. Difficult. Yeah, I'd actually, I know of some new approaches that you're also bringing to POV, American Documentaries flagship series, as well as the ongoing America ReFramed. And I'm just curious if maybe you can talk about what you're thinking about in terms of POV and the programming that's happening there, since that wasn't as much touched upon in your talk.
Sure. I mean, there are a couple of things we're looking at. Number one is when I talk about stretching us and stretching our audiences, we're also trying to look at different ways to reach people. One thing that finding is when you have documentaries sometimes that are a little more artistic and less overtly political, people are more willing to engage.
And that's kind of returning to POV's roots,
yes,
in a way, with
yes.
like POV being the broadcast origin of Marlon Riggs films and
exactly.
Suzanne Phillips and Camille Phillips and so on. Yeah.
And I think that we need to find different ways to engage, different ways to bring people in, different ways to discuss. And it is, I think it's a mandate for us as a community to not create films that are just, as you said, going to be seen by the same people in the same echo chamber, which is why public media is so important. We had one film recently, Wuhan, and we got a note from a viewer who it was somewhere in the Northwest. And he wrote and said, until I saw your film, I wasn't really thinking of the Chinese people suffering through this like us. I was just thinking of them as the people who created this disease, which highly problematic, of course. But it was also interesting to hear that there's just a kernel there of maybe opening his mind a little bit. And I think that's one of the things that films can do and that films need to do is create these spaces where someone like that can watch something and start to realize, maybe I do need to think a little differently.
So it's being a little bit realistic about the actual, evidentiary capacity of documentary filmmaking. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I do. That would be a good way to sum it up.
All right. Well, virtual audience, you're being a little bit shy, it appears. I see lots of claps for Erika. A lot of thank you. Comments, such a powerful speaker. But let me know if you have any questions, just drop them directly into chat. I will do my best to look down and see what it is that you're saying. But meanwhile, in the room, yes, so we do have a question. We're going to run the mic to you. Thanks, Louise.
Thank you, Erika, for your talk. Very, very moving. I'm interested to hear that the growing audience for public media is audiences of color and younger people, because I think we've been living in fear that Sesame Street and then the audience goes away and then what's left are gray-haired boomers. Do you think that there can be enough change happening nationally in public media that it will save itself before it completely goes off the cliff?
I think it has to. And I think there is a realization that the traditional audience is literally dying. So there have to be changes in how public media reaches people. For instance, I know that the people who engage with POV are inspired by, stories of, young queer Black activists, of, people who are, working to save the last abortion clinic on the border, of stories that really span the diaspora in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, ability, and bring in new ideas. I think typically people have not felt that this was a space for them or where they could find those things. There's, there are only so many times that you can see advertisements of Antiques Roadshow and think that there's going to be something for you on PBS.
But Antiques Roadshow is such a hit, Erika. You don't need to respond to that. Any other questions in the audience? All right, we have one in the back.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for your keynote. And also it was so nice to have lunch with you a couple of days ago. But I have a question because you specifically mentioned people in decision-making roles and gatekeeping roles, and that maybe our quotas or numbers of diversification inside of those roles is improving, but there's a lot of field for growth. And so maybe for other people in decision-making power, you have examples of how you're trying to integrate that into your work, working as an executive level in public television, especially because for young people, well, I'm not very young anymore. I'm on the cusp of aging out of being a young person, but I think I'm definitely on the cusp. It's coming to the end. I'm pulling out my gray hairs on the daily. But I think that there is sometimes a misunderstanding that also public media isn't for young people and we need to keep them engaged, but that also means we need young people in decision-making power, also in those fields, which POV probably also, in my limited scientific knowledge, but at least observation, has a better, higher number of young people in decision-making roles, which is so great. But maybe you have advice for other people in the broadcast landscape about, maybe plans for succession, for bringing people in, how you're already integrating this in your own work.
That was 3 questions, Bridget, but thank you very much. They were all amazing questions.
All right, Bridget. Well, one thing I will say is I think it's always important to have a diversity of voices, whether it's young people, whether it's people of different ethnicities or different abilities. And so I am a little loath to say that we need to bring X group to make decisions. I think we need to make sure that there is a democratization of decision making. And also one of the things that I think is important is when you're dealing with something that hits a certain group or, deals with a certain ethnicity, that you have the right people in the room to make, decisions about it, to answer questions about it. And you have to be humble enough to say, I can guide this process, I can lead this process, but I cannot be the only decision maker in this process. And I think one of the roles is to curate an environment where those decision makers are not just there, but feel that they have the ability and the power to speak and to make decisions. I have a friend who was a VP at, one of the major public broadcast entities. And she was one of the first women of color to hold the position that she had. And she said that routinely she would sit there and hear things that she just couldn't believe and would say, which one am I going to pick this week? Because I really only will get one. And that's a problem. She should be able to speak about any issue that she thinks is important to the coverage and the audience. And what I hope that we can create is the environment where people feel free to speak and to discuss, but also to disagree with each other. I think that a healthy level of disagreement and debate is something often that we shy away from. And we want to avoid harm, but I also hope that we are willing to create spaces where people can try to express themselves with good intentions. I remember I was at an event, this was about 6 years ago, and the person said, it doesn't matter what you said. The intent is not important. It's the reaction it creates. And I remember thinking, so if my son walks into a store and a little old lady grabs her purse because she's afraid that he came to steal something when all he wanted to do was buy himself a candy bar, is that his fault or his problem? And I sometimes think that we aren't willing to look at sometimes not just the intent, but the causes of the action. And is harm something that can be addressed in a particular way? Are there different levels? How do we look at it? And I think sometimes we're afraid to even discuss the idea.
If there's other questions in the room, Anand, I will get to you in a second, but now we have questions in the Q&A. By the way, Erika has very generously given me the power to decide how long this Q&A is. So thank you, Erika. But I promise we'll get to your question. We have some very interesting questions in chat. I will say there are some that are specifically about different strands in public media and things like that. I will actually, I rarely do this, but I will actually table these questions because we do have a panel tomorrow that one of the panelists is in the room here is on, called Evolving Mandates in Public Media, and we are going to talk much more specifically about those things in public media. So please join us for that panel. It is at 3:30 or 3:15, but check the schedule for the exact details. And so I'm going to actually go to a question from Emerson Gu. Thank you, Emerson. Erika, you talked about putting the public back in public media. How do we do that when this golden age of documentary is increasingly commercialized? Obviously, we can't just wish for the glory days of public access TV to come back. I will also make a distinction here that public access is different than public media. So what are some new possibilities for public documentary media?
Okay, well, first of all, Emerson, I am very pleased to hear your name. That was my grandfather's name. And second, I would say that one of the things that we have to look at is what we want to do with documentaries as a community and the audiences that we try and reach. Many of the documentaries that we get for POV are from filmmakers who really have a goal and a mission for their documentary to reach many audiences and don't want to see it streamed, next to a bunch of reality shows on Netflix. So part of it is about reaching the filmmakers who really want to be part of this public experiment. Another piece of it is, I think that we've got to reach out also to more and to different filmmakers. We tend to take films that come to us, and I want to see us going to find more films like the Congo and Harlem educational films, opportunities for filmmakers who are not going to be part of this commercial stream and who may need a little more support, who may need a little more coaching, but who can create narratives that we wouldn't hear otherwise, and who can bring to us things that we don't normally get, on Amazon Prime. I also think that we need to invest more in public media. One of the things that I think is important is that filmmakers shouldn't have to sacrifice to be part of public media. I mean, we're not going to pay what you get at Netflix. It's not going to happen. It's a different choice. It's kind of like, that's up to you. But I do think that the difference should not be so great. And I wish and think that we should invest more in really our public airwaves and look at them as more of a public good and so important to the fabric of this country.
That's a really great point. One of the distinctions of public media is that you're not just a gatekeeper yourself, you are beholden to the public and the tax.
It's a service. We are a service. And we owe a debt to our audiences for allowing us to be in control of this service.
Absolutely. Kind of a short question, but a little bit of a peppery one. From
I like pepper.
Yeah, from Joyce Hart. Question: is there a future on PBS for traditional humanities-based films or series that are not Ken Burns series?
I would say yes, and I would say that we are working to create these opportunities. As a matter of fact, I think there are some in the works right now, but I think also that that's part of the change. One person can't do everything. One voice can't say everything, and that's part of putting the public back in public media.
So part of this is encouraging everyone to feel invested in the future of public media so we can all advocate for these things together.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, Anand, we have one of our other keynote speakers in our room here who's been making documentaries for decades. You have the mic.
Yeah, actually, okay. I came a little late because I'm challenged by the taxi app that I had.
know.
It wasn't
Happened to
working.
me yesterday.
So you may have already talked about this, but I was really interested in that you worked at the Maysles theater in cinema in Harlem. And I have a friend who's now running it, and he's invited me to show my film there. So I was really excited about that. But I just wanted to know how it came about. How did Albert Maysles decide to do this, or was he the only one who did it? Or
It was Albert and his wife Jillian, and they decided that they were going to sell their Studio 54 office, and they wanted to move their life and their work to a community where they felt that they could make a difference by being there. And they'd looked at some places in Brooklyn, they'd looked in Queens, and they settled in Harlem. And I actually found the cinema just by walking by one day, and the doors were open and they were having a World Cup party, and just came in and there was free popcorn. And that's how I first was introduced to it. I mean, I was amused because I saw the name Maysles on the door, but it was just, I mean, it was literally like a storefront drive-by.
well, I do have. If other people, I don't want to.
I'm curious, follow up.
Oh, okay, not about this particular thing. My follow-up is completely different. It's not to do with the cinema, which I will.
Is it about this
speak to.
talk?
Yeah, but
Is it about this talk?
it is. It is to do with the fact that public service broadcasting that exists right now. Does it also include talking about the rest of the world apart from America?
Yes.
And to what extent does it do that? And how does it do that? In the sense that,
Not well.
yeah, because it's one thing to send people to other countries for a few days or weeks and make the film and come. But it's another thing to actually show the films that come out of there.
That is, oh my goodness, so glad you said that, because that is one of my biggest mandates right now, which is that not only do we need to get films from filmmakers who maybe don't have the money or the access to go to an IDFA or a TIFF or a CPH Docs, we need to go to them. We need to go to places and festivals and interact with, filmmakers and curators in different countries who can help us to find authentic films, who can help us to let people know that there are opportunities for these films here. We are slowly working, I think of our 15 films this year, 7 are international films. Teresa, is that right? Yeah. And we are slowly working to have half of these films come from different countries. I particularly am focused on Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia, but also am open to things from anywhere where there is an authentic voice. And also, I want us to find films that it's not easy to find. I want us to talk to people. We have to do the work. I often say it's left and right. You have to walk over to people and ask them the questions and honestly probe to find that. I'm going to several film festivals this year that I'd never heard of before this year, because they're places where the bar to entry is low. The filmmakers, the film festival organizers I've spoken to and believe in what they're curating and how they're curating it. And I believe it's our job to bring those to this audience.
Sorry, a quick follow-up, not to this particular question, but actually it's about.
This is your last question, Anand.
I curate, I do show films in India, documentaries, and I've stolen sometimes PBS. I mean, I've shown, there's no mechanism by which we can get them and show them in our countries very easily. So I showed Eyes on the Prize and a lot of stuff, which I thought was.
I worked on that in college.
Yeah. So, yeah, how, not just taking the films from the South and showing them here, but also allowing your great films to be shown there.
That for us is a lot more difficult because we don't deal with a lot of the rights and distribution that filmmakers have beyond these North American rights. I think it is something that most filmmakers want to do and want to be able to offer access for. It's somewhat outside of what we do, but again, I think it's something that's important in that it would be great to be able to do. But one of the reasons that we only take a licensing window and a North American licensing window is to give filmmakers the opportunity to be able to sell their films in other markets as well, because as we know, nobody in here is getting rich off of the films that they're making.
Thank you. Okay. It's okay. We'll hear plenty more from you tomorrow. I'm on. Let's see. We have a couple more questions. I think I'm going to end with these last 2 questions from the virtual chat. They're a little bit connected. And I think thank you, Anand, because it seems like you opened up some corridors of questioning for the virtual audience as well. One question from Suyan. You talked about this. The brave act is to listen to those who make us uncomfortable, those whose stories hold deeper scars that for generations we have failed to heal. How will public media address this on POV and America ReFramed?
those are great questions. One of the things that I'm trying to make sure that we do is that we don't stray away from hearing the uncomfortable stories, the uncomfortable narratives. And it's a balancing act because we want to engage and inform people, and we want to not really gloss over a lot of the harm that's done, a lot of the marginalization that's been created. And the question is, how do we balance that? I mean, one of the things that I found often in Mississippi with friends that I had is that their grandparents wouldn't tell them about some of the things that had happened when they were young because they didn't want them to carry that burden. And I think we have to carry that burden. We have to get people to talk, but we have to let them do it on their own terms. And I think the only way to do that is to give them control of the story, to give them the microphone and to let them speak themselves. And that's what I'm hoping that we can do more of.
All right, I've been corrected in chat. The previous question was actually from Sue Kim, who's yes, just don't want to sometimes people have different names that show up online than the names that we know them colloquially by. There's also lots of love in chat for one of the commenters. And the final question, so this is a little bit related to what Anand also was talking about. It's from Adam Maysles. Erika, you mentioned going and finding films from makers outside of the US. Great. But how about supporting makers in other places from the start? I believe that would mean in production or development.
Yes.
How can we move resources in this way?
What I am hoping to do, and this is a program that I'm trying to start, is when and if we go to smaller festivals, to be able to award some small development prizes to interesting ideas. It does bother me that we tend to get involved only after all the hard work is done of getting, together the money to make enough of a film to be able to show it to somebody else. So yeah, it's something that I think is really important.
Type of films that you're considering.
Exactly.
Type of maker.
Exactly.
Who's already perhaps better resourced than
exactly. And I also think that we have to be willing to put the development money out there for films that may never make it to us. I feel that we have a responsibility within this community to use the access and power that we have to lift up this entire idea of filmmaking and authentic storytellers. And, that if it's something that could never make it to PBS and America ReFramed, I don't really care. I think, well, I'd like to have it, but I think it's important to support the filmmakers and the filmmaking, not just the production of things that could work for us.
Well, thank you very much, Erika. I'm very much hoping for more executive producers and executive directors like you, who are thinking so expansively about the systems of development and circulation when it comes to the films under our care. Let's give her another round of applause. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Abby.